You need to hear this slowly. You are not lazy, you are not broken, and you are not failing because you lack intelligence or effort. You work, you try, you push forward again and again, yet money behaves strangely around you. It comes close, it touches your life, and then it slips away. Sometimes through unexpected expenses, sometimes through missed opportunities, sometimes through choices you can't fully explain. And what hurts the most is this feeling you rarely say out loud. I do everything right, so why doesn't it stay? The answer does not live in your bank account. It lives much deeper. It lives in a pattern that was formed long before you ever earned your first dollar, a pattern you did not consciously choose, a pattern that was impressed into you when your nervous system was still learning what safety meant. This is where most people stop listening, because they assume this conversation is about blame. It is not. It is about origin. You were shaped in an environment where love, protection, fear, and survival were transmitted not through explanations, but through emotion. And emotion does not ask permission before it becomes law inside you. As a child, you learned what was safe. You learned what was dangerous. You learned what brought approval and what created tension. And one of the most powerful signals you absorbed was this. What happens when someone has more? More attention, more visibility, more responsibility, more money. You may not remember the exact words spoken, but your body remembers the tone, the pauses, the warnings hidden inside concern. You learned whether abundance meant stability or whether it meant risk, whether success meant pride or whether it meant separation, whether having more meant being protected or being exposed. And here is the truth few people are willing to face. If at any point your system learned that prosperity threatens connection, you will unconsciously limit prosperity to preserve connection, not because you want to suffer, but because survival always outranks success. This is not a moral failure. It is an ancient biological and spiritual response. You did not decide this with logic. You absorbed it through love. And that is why money feels emotional to you, even when you pretend it isn't. You may tell yourself you want abundance, but another part of you is still asking a much older question. If I receive more, what will I lose? This is where the blockage begins, not with greed, not with irresponsibility, but with loyalty. Loyalty to an emotional imprint that once kept you safe. You may notice it when opportunity arrives and you hesitate, when success feels exciting but strangely heavy, when receiving help triggers discomfort instead of relief. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern repeating itself quietly, faithfully, obediently. And until it is seen, it will continue to operate without your consent. This chapter is not here to accuse anyone. It is here to restore clarity. Because once you recognize the pattern, it no longer controls you from the shadows. It waits for your awareness. And awareness is the beginning of release. You are not here by accident. You are here because something inside you is ready to look deeper. And in the next chapter, you will understand why this pattern does not disappear with positive thinking, motivation, or hard work alone. And why ancient wisdom treated money not as currency, but as permission to receive life. You were taught to believe that effort guarantees results, that discipline creates reward, that if you work hard enough, long enough, consistently enough, abundance will eventually obey. And yet, your lived experience tells a different story. You have seen people work less and receive more. You have watched doors open for others with ease, while yours required force. You have done everything right, and still felt the quiet anxiety of instability. This creates confusion, and confusion over time turns into self-doubt. But the ancient wisdom you are now encountering never measured prosperity by effort alone. It measured it by alignment, because effort without permission is exhausting. And permission is not something you grant consciously. Permission is something your system either allows or resists. You can push forward with ambition, you can learn strategies, you can increase skill. But if, deep inside, receiving more feels unsafe, your system will quietly apply the brakes, not dramatically, not visibly, subtly. You will delay decisions, you will undervalue your work, you will choose familiarity over expansion, and you will call it logic. This is why positive thinking fails you, because positivity speaks to the surface of the mind, while the blockage lives in the body and memory. You do not resist abundance because you dislike it. You resist it because your system still associates it with consequences, loss of closeness, loss of approval, loss of protection. As a child, you depended on emotional harmony to survive. So you learned to read the environment carefully. You noticed what created tension. You noticed what brought relief. And if struggle was familiar, struggle became safe. Not comfortable, but predictable. The nervous system prefers predictable pain over unfamiliar peace. This is why, even now, you may feel a strange pull back to what you know, even when what you know limits you. The wisdom behind this teaching explains that money is not just material, it is symbolic. It represents flow, trust, expansion, and expansion requires inner authorization. If part of you believes that having more will disrupt emotional balance, you will unconsciously choose balance over abundance, even if that balance includes stress. This is not weakness. It is intelligence misapplied to a reality that no longer exists. The child needed protection, the adult needs permission, but the system does not update automatically. It waits for awareness. That is why nothing changes simply because you decide it should, because decisions live in the mind, and permission lives deeper. You may notice this when you receive money and feel uneasy instead of calm, when saving feels harder than spending, when stability feels unfamiliar. These reactions are signals, not failures. They are messages asking to be understood, not overridden. The teaching you are entering now does not shame these responses. It honors them, because once something protected you, and gratitude must come before correction. You cannot release a pattern you are still fighting. You must first see why it existed, and only then can you separate past danger from present reality. In the next chapter, you will encounter a living example, a story passed through generations that shows how love, protection, and fear can unintentionally close the channel of receiving, not to create guilt, but to create freedom. Because once you understand the story, you are no longer trapped inside it. You are standing outside it, and from there, something begins to shift. You were not taught these patterns through lectures. You learned them through atmosphere, through what was said quietly, through what was avoided, through the emotional reactions that followed moments of expansion. As a child, you were always watching, not with judgment but with instinct. You watched how adults reacted to money. You watched what happened when bills arrived. You watched how success was discussed or silenced. And most importantly, you watched the one figure who represented safety, survival, and belonging. Your nervous system learned from her long before your mind ever formed conclusions. If she worried, you absorbed caution. If she feared loss, you absorbed restraint. If she associated more with danger, you absorbed the message that staying small keeps love intact. This does not require cruelty to exist. It only requires concern. And concern is powerful. You may remember phrases spoken with care, not control, words meant to protect, not restrict. Be careful, don't get your hopes up. Money changes people. It's better not to depend on too much. These words were not instructions, they were emotional signals, and emotion becomes law inside a child. You learned without ever deciding that expansion could threaten stability, that visibility could attract danger, that receiving too much might cost something precious. So you adapted. You learned to stay within invisible boundaries. You learn to manage expectations. You learn to keep desire quiet. And you carried these lessons forward, even as your life changed. Now, as an adult, you may find yourself repeating the same pattern in different forms. You pursue opportunities, but stop short of claiming them fully. You receive income, but feel uneasy holding on to it. You desire abundance, but feel guilty wanting more. This is not contradiction. It is loyalty. Loyalty to an emotional agreement you never consciously signed. You may even defend the pattern. You may say you are realistic. You may say you don't need much. You may say money isn't everything. And while these statements can be true, they can also be shields, because wanting less feels safer than risking disapproval, even if that disapproval no longer exists. This is the quiet tragedy of inherited fear. It outlives its original context. The teaching you are encountering now explains that love and limitation often arrive together, not because love intends harm, but because protection always comes from the past. The parent protects based on what once hurt them. The child adapts based on what once frightened the parent, and the cycle continues unless someone becomes conscious that someone is you, not to accuse, not to rebel, but to differentiate. You are allowed to honor the love without inheriting the fear. You are allowed to respect the intention without repeating the pattern. This requires something subtle and courageous. You must recognize that the fear you carry is not yours. It is borrowed, and borrowed fear can be returned, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with clarity. You may notice resistance even reading this, a tightening, a desire to defend, minimize, or dismiss. That resistance is not a problem. It is evidence. It shows where loyalty still lives. And loyalty does not dissolve through force. It dissolves through acknowledgement. You are not betraying anyone by choosing to receive more. You are not abandoning values by expanding your capacity. You are simply updating a system that no longer needs the same rules. In the next chapter, you will understand how this emotional imprint becomes an internal governor, a silent mechanism that regulates how much you allow yourself to have, and why this mechanism operates even when logic disagrees. Because once you see the mechanism, you can begin to disengage from it, and that is where true freedom starts. What you are facing now is not a lack of ambition. It is an internal regulator, an invisible limiter that quietly decides how much you are allowed to receive before discomfort appears. This limiter was not designed to punish you. It was designed to protect you. Long before you understood money, status, or success, your system learned one essential rule. Staying within certain boundaries keeps me safe. That rule did not disappear when you grew up. It simply became more sophisticated. Now, instead of external warnings, it operates internally. It shows up as hesitation, as second-guessing, as a strange sense of pressure when things start going well. You may experience it as self-sabotage, but that word is too harsh. What is actually happening is self-regulation. Your system is trying to prevent an emotional state it once associated with danger. When abundance begins to exceed that old boundary, the limiter activates, not with panic, with subtle redirection. You procrastinate. You rationalize, you lower expectations, you tell yourself you're being responsible, and in a way, you are, just not for the present moment. You are being responsible for a past reality that no longer exists. This is why logic alone cannot free you. You can understand that money is neutral. You can believe that prosperity is good. You can consciously desire expansion. But the limiter does not speak logic, it speaks sensation. It responds to what feels safe, not to what makes sense. This is why you may notice physical reactions when dealing with money. Tension in the chest, restlessness, a need to escape or distract. These reactions are not flaws, they are messages. They tell you where the old boundary still lives. The ancient teaching behind this wisdom explains that abundance flows where there is inner permission. Not permission granted once, but permission sustained. And permission can only be sustained when the system feels safe receiving. If receiving more once led to emotional instability, your system will ensure that instability never returns, even at the cost of growth. This is why abundance sometimes feels heavier than lack, because lack is familiar, and familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. You may wonder why this pattern repeats even when circumstances improve. Why new income streams still don't bring peace. Why raises don't eliminate anxiety. Why financial wins feel temporary. It is because the limiter is not satisfied with numbers. It wants reassurance. It wants to know that receiving more will not isolate you, that it will not disrupt belonging, that it will not lead to emotional loss. Until that reassurance is given, the limiter remains active, and it does not need your permission to operate. It has been in control longer than your adult identity has existed. But here is the turning point. The limiter is not an enemy. It is outdated protection. And outdated protection can be updated, but only through understanding, not force. If you try to overpower it, it will resist harder. If you shame it, it will retreat deeper. But if you recognize its origin, it begins to loosen. Because the moment your system realizes that the danger has passed, it no longer needs to enforce the same restrictions. This is not about erasing the past. It is about contextualizing it. You are no longer dependent. You are no longer powerless. You are no longer surviving someone else's fear. You are here, now, with choice. And choice changes everything, but only when it reaches the level where the limiter operates. In the next chapter, you will learn how this internal boundary specifically affects your relationship with money, how it shapes the way you earn, hold, spend, and lose, and why certain financial patterns repeat until the emotional contract behind them is consciously revised. You are getting closer, not to a technique, but to a release. And that is where real change begins. You may believe that your financial life is shaped by decisions, opportunities, and external circumstances. But what actually shapes it most powerfully is repetition. Not the repetition you plan, the repetition you inherit. Patterns repeat because they are familiar, and familiarity creates a false sense of safety. You may notice that money enters your life in cycles, a period of relief, a moment of expansion, then a quiet return to tension. This is not random. Your system has learned a specific financial temperature that feels acceptable. Anything above it triggers discomfort. Anything below it feels familiar even if it hurts. So the pattern corrects itself. If you earn more than feels emotionally safe, you find ways to release it. Unexpected expenses, generosity that leaves you depleted, investments chosen more from urgency than clarity. If you approach stability, something inside you becomes restless. You may feel bored, disconnected, uneasy, and that unease pushes movement. This is why some people unconsciously create crises, not because they enjoy suffering, but because crisis restores emotional equilibrium. It returns them to what their system knows how to manage. You may recognize this in how you relate to spending. Saving may feel restrictive. Holding on to money may feel tense. Spending, on the other hand, may feel like relief, even when it creates stress later. This is not irresponsibility, it is regulation. The pattern also shows up in how you value yourself. You may underprice your work. You may avoid asking for more. You may feel uncomfortable charging what reflects your true effort, and when you do receive more, you may feel exposed, as if you are being watched, judged, or tested. That feeling does not come from the present. It comes from the past. It comes from the original association between having more and emotional risk. Your system learned that staying within limits preserved harmony, so it learned to enforce those limits internally. This enforcement is quiet, automatic. You rarely notice it happening. You simply feel off when things go too well. You lose motivation, you doubt yourself, and you interpret these sensations as truth. But they are not truth. They are signals from an old contract, a contract that says, "I will not exceed what feels safe to receive." This is why money patterns are so stubborn. You can change strategies and still repeat outcomes. You can switch environments and still feel the same tension, because the pattern travels with you. It lives in how you relate to receiving. The teaching behind this wisdom explains that money responds to your internal state more than your external actions. It follows the path of least resistance, and resistance is emotional, not logical. If receiving more creates inner conflict, the flow will slow, not as punishment, as protection. You may notice this pattern even when help is offered. You hesitate to accept support. You feel you must earn everything through effort. You resist ease. Because ease feels unfamiliar, struggle feels earned, struggle feels justified, ease feels suspicious, and so you unconsciously push it away. This does not make you weak, it makes you loyal to a system that once ensured emotional survival. But loyalty does not have to mean permanence. You are allowed to renegotiate. You are allowed to say, "What once protected me no longer defines me." But renegotiation requires awareness. You cannot change what you still mistake for reality. And now you are beginning to see the pattern not as fate, but as habit, not as destiny, but as memory. In the next chapter, you will learn how to begin separating love from fear, how to honor what was given to you without continuing to live under its limitations, and how to create internal safety for receiving more without guilt. This is where the shift becomes possible, not through force, but through permission, and permission changes everything. At some point, awareness reaches a threshold. You no longer feel confused. You no longer feel lost. Instead, you feel something more uncomfortable: clarity. Because clarity reveals a difficult truth. The pattern you carry was built from love, but sustained by fear. And this is where most people stop. Not because they don't understand, but because they believe that changing means betraying. Betraying values, betraying family, betraying the emotional contract that once kept them safe. But this belief is another illusion created by the pattern itself. You are not asked to reject your past. You are asked to differentiate from it. There is a crucial difference. Love can remain. Gratitude can remain. Respect can remain. What must change is the unconscious equation that says, if I receive more, I risk losing connection. That equation is no longer true. But your system does not update itself through time. It updates through experience and reassurance. This is why intellectual understanding alone does not dissolve the fear. The fear lives in a place that requires emotional permission. So the work here is not confrontation, it is separation. You begin by acknowledging the intention behind what you inherited. The concern was real, the protection was real, the fear made sense in its original context. You do not dismiss it, you honor it, and then gently you return what does not belong to you. You recognize that the fear was shaped by a world that no longer exists, by circumstances you are no longer living, by limitations that are not yours to carry forward. This act is subtle but profound. It does not require speaking to anyone. It does not require explanation or conflict. It requires an internal shift. You stop asking for permission to receive, and you begin granting it to yourself. This may sound simple, but your system will resist at first. Not aggressively, quietly. You may feel guilt when imagining ease. You may feel disloyal when imagining abundance. You may feel selfish when imagining stability. These feelings are not warnings, they are echoes. Echoes of a time when safety depended on restraint. You do not need to argue with these feelings. You need to reassure them. You are no longer a child dependent on emotional harmony for survival. You are an adult capable of holding connection and expansion at the same time. This is what the pattern has not yet learned. So you teach it. You do not do this by forcing success. You do it by normalizing receiving, by allowing good things to arrive without rushing them away, by letting stability feel boring instead of threatening, by staying present when things go well. This is harder than it sounds, because your system is accustomed to motion, tension, correction. Peace may feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliar often feels unsafe at first, so you practice staying. Staying with ease, staying with sufficiency, staying with moments where nothing is wrong. This is how the limiter begins to soften, not through ambition, but through safety. You show your system that nothing bad happens when you have more. That connection does not disappear, that love is not withdrawn, and slowly the old association begins to loosen. You are not erasing your history. You are contextualizing it. You are saying, "Thank you for protecting me. I no longer need this protection." This is not rejection, it is completion, and completion brings relief. In the next and final chapter, you will be guided into integration. How to stabilize this shift, how to prevent the pattern from reasserting itself under stress, and how to anchor a new internal agreement with receiving that does not depend on struggle. This is where the story resolves, not with a dramatic transformation, but with something far more powerful, consistency, and that is what creates lasting change. There is a quiet moment when something shifts, not suddenly, not dramatically. It happens when you stop bracing, when you realize that nothing needs to be proven anymore. That effort no longer has to justify your right to receive. This is the moment where the old pattern loses its authority, because patterns only survive when they are unquestioned. Now you see it. You recognize when the familiar tension tries to return. You notice the urge to create urgency. You feel the impulse to shrink just as expansion becomes possible, and instead of obeying it, you pause. This pause is the most powerful act you can make. In the pause, you are no longer reacting from memory. You are choosing from presence. You allow yourself to stay with receiving, not as a reward, but as a state. You let money sit without rushing to release it. You let success exist without preparing for loss. You let stability be ordinary. This is how receiving becomes permanent, not by increasing income endlessly, but by removing the internal expiration date. The ancient wisdom behind this teaching explains that abundance settles where it is welcomed without fear. When fear is removed, flow stabilizes. You may notice changes that seem subtle but are profound. Decisions become calmer. Opportunities feel less charged. You stop oscillating between hope and anxiety. You begin to trust continuity. This trust does not come from optimism. It comes from evidence. Evidence that nothing collapses when you receive more. Evidence that connection remains intact. Evidence that ease does not erase your values. And as this evidence accumulates, the system updates. The limiter no longer needs to intervene. The cycle no longer needs to reset. This is when repetition changes direction. Instead of repeating loss, you repeat stability. Instead of cycling through tension, you cycle through sufficiency. This does not mean life becomes perfect. Challenges still exist, but they no longer define your baseline. You are no longer managing money from fear. You are relating to it from neutrality, and neutrality is powerful because when money is no longer charged emotionally, it becomes functional. It flows where it is needed. It stays where it is valued. You may still hear the old voice occasionally, the warning, the hesitation, but it no longer controls you. It is a memory, not a command. You do not argue with it. You acknowledge it and continue. This is what maturity looks like on an internal level. You are no longer living inside an inherited story. You are authoring a new one, not by rejecting the past, but by integrating it. You carry the love forward, you release the fear, and in doing so, you change not only your relationship with money, but your relationship with receiving life itself. This is the quiet freedom that lasts. Not excitement, not constant growth, but peace. Peace with having, peace with holding, peace with allowing good to remain. And from that place, abundance is no longer something you chase. It is something that recognizes you and stays. This is where the journey completes, not with effort, not with force, but with permission. And that permission now belongs to you.